AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Our host brings you the leading minds in AI, sharing their story, their success, and their advice. Focusing on fast-tracking you to the top, AI in Action cuts through the hype to help you kickstart your data science career. To listen to the latest AI in Action podcast, head over to www.alldus.com/podcast or subscribe via iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Podcasts.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Alldus podcast. I'm your host, Ben Sparks, and today we are continuing with our Digital Transformation series, interviewing some of the best and brightest leaders and technical talent from across the ServiceNow and wider digital transformation ecosystem. Today we are lucky to host Sean McDermott. Sean currently holds the position of President and CEO at Windward Consulting, a ServiceNow Premier Partner. However, their business is much more holistic and they focus on a number of different areas, including overarching AIOps, service deployment and service management. The practice has a heavy presence in the government space, however, also has a presence in the commercial sector. Sean is a serial entrepreneur with over 20 years experience working with global federal clients. He is an expert in large-scale IT transformations and is passionate about moving IT from a cost of doing business to a competitive differentiator in the market. He not only runs Windward Consulting, but is also front and center with most of their C-suite customers, helping them align strategic objectives and execute on their IT landscape transformation plans. But today is going to touch on a number of topics, however, having a focus on Windward's unique value proposition to their customers, some overarching digital transformation trends transforming the government sectors, how and why AIOps is so important, and he's going to share some leadership and best practice and mentorship along the way. So Sean, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. Really excited to be here.
No, I'm glad you could make it. So Sean, let's start by giving our listeners an overview of who they're listening to. Give us a bit about your current role and responsibilities.
Yeah, so currently I am the CEO and founder of Windward Consulting Group. It's a US-based consultancy focused on IT operations management for primarily Fortune 500 companies and the federal government. We actually also focus on AIOps as one of our core capabilities. And I founded that company in 1997. So we're in our 24th year there. I'm also the CEO and founder of Red Monocle, which is the leading cyber risk quantification. And we call that CRQ. It's a mouthful, cyber risk quantification. But so let's call it CRQ, a platform that allows cybersecurity leaders to find, fund, fix, and quantify their cybersecurity risk blind spots, which is front and center in the news right nowadays with the hack on Colonial Pipeline. And this company I founded in 2018, so we're relatively new in this space.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And a part of the podcast is showcasing leaders. I think it's very easy for people to think that senior people have always been senior and forget that there's a story behind there. Sean, if you don't mind, I'd love to know a bit about your history and maybe even touch on some of the milestones or tipping points that you've had along the way.
Sure. I graduated with a degree in electrical engineering from Villanova University in Philadelphia, and I got my master's in engineering management from Catholic University in Washington, D.C. I got my degree while working at really where I began my career was at the United States Department of Justice. I was in engineering training there with a group of new engineers, really at the dawn of the internet. So I started there in 1988. And I had a pretty good run there for a few years. I did some pretty innovative stuff. We actually created the first private internet connection for the DOJ. So the entire department's internet connection was running on a SCO Unix server running under my desk. I registered usdoj.gov, sent the first email, and actually deployed the first IP-based network. I believe we deployed the first IP-based network in the civilian government by a little known company back in the day called Cisco. I then moved from there to Booz Allen Hamilton, one of the premier global strategic consulting firms. I knew I wanted to get into consulting, so when they made me an offer, I grabbed that and ran with it. And there I started to, as companies were deploying, IP networks and the early days of technologies like HP OpenView, I really saw my path less as designing and building the networks, but really on the manageability of it. And that's basically defined my career since then. And so then I was there for about 5 years. I took a small stint at a consulting company out in New York City in 1996, but after a year I left and started Windward. So Like I said, we are now in our 24th year there, again, focused on operations management and building out management capabilities for large Fortune 500 companies. And in 2004, I started RealOps, which was the first runbook automation platform on the market. That was really an offshoot of technology and integration work that we were doing at Windward. And I was lucky enough to be able to spin that off. We raised some venture funding, ran that for 2 years and 9 months before BMC called us and made an offer we couldn't refuse. So we sold that to BMC. It's now, I believe it's still called BMC TrueSight Orchestrator. And it used to be called Atrium Orchestrator. And then in 2011, I and one of my co-founders at RealOps, we started a company called App47. That was really focused on mobile application management to corporate organizations that are designing and building their own custom mobile apps and a way of distributing them outside of the Apple or Google Play App Store ecosystem. And that company's still going. And then in 2018, I started RealOps, Red Monocle. And again, we're focused on CRQ there. So I'm described as a serial entrepreneur. I'm more of a parallel entrepreneur.
Right.
It would be a lot easier if I could do them one after the other, but ideas come and they're too good not to do. And I usually have several companies in play at one time, which it takes up a lot of time, but it's very fulfilling.
Definitely keeps you out of trouble and definitely not boring by any stretch of the imagination, I can imagine. And it's interesting, a lot of people, you hear the word entrepreneur, it's thrown about quite a lot now. It's a good buzzword, but wow, you seriously are a serial entrepreneur or parallel entrepreneur, I should say.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a friend of mine who serial entrepreneur too, and he basically said, you're not a true entrepreneur until you've missed payroll, you've been fired from a company, and you run with the bulls in Pamplona. So I've done the first two. He keeps trying to get me to do the third, and I'm not there yet. So maybe I'm not a true entrepreneur. But yeah, until you haven't been able to make payroll one time, then it's hard to say you're actually a real entrepreneur.
No, I can imagine. And these are the learns that probably only the when you're at the CEO, that is interesting, isn't it? That those responsibilities weigh quite heavily on people. And I must admit, everyone I speak to at a senior level who probably has those responsibilities does really well at not showing that is probably a heavy burden. So Windward specifically, obviously you've given us a bit of the timeline. I'd love to know more about the company and maybe some of the history and the overview, if you don't mind, in a bit more detail.
Sure. The genesis of Windward was my work at Booz Allen, which I thoroughly enjoyed working at Booz Allen. It was a great company to be at. I wouldn't be here today without working there because the way they do things and the way they train you, it was fantastic. But the challenge I saw was that as we were doing a lot of strategic advisory work, I felt like we were missing out on some of the technological expertise of deploying these strategies, and also having stronger relationships with companies in the space, technology companies in space, like IBM or HP back in the day, or even Oracle. And at the time, Booz Allen didn't really want to do that because they felt like it was going to really put their unbiased reputation in jeopardy if they were working with likes of large technology companies. But I felt it was really critical for our strategy and the credibility of our strategy. If we're laying out something for the next 3 to 5 years, if we had actually done it, then we know where the strengths and weaknesses are and the pitfalls, things like that. So I started Windward in 1997 based on that. And we have a very tight focus on operations management for large scale IT infrastructures. So we don't do the day-to-day management. We don't staff NOCs and help desks and things like that, like an outsourcer might do. Rather, we build all the tools that those people use. So when you see pictures of a network operating center, almost like a command center, and you see all the screens with all the blinking lights and the tools, software, that's what we do. We build all that. And it's a lot of complex systems, right? When you're starting to work with companies that have 180,000 servers, and how do you push a security patch across 180,000 servers in one night? That gets very complex. So our real claim to fame is we operate on scale, right? So our customers are the biggest of the biggest, with millions of customers and hundreds of thousands of employees. Their IT infrastructure are amazingly complex. And I think 99.9% of the consumers out there really have no idea how complex these infrastructures are. on the back end to do very simple things, make a phone call, pick up your cell phone and call your mom. It's an incredibly complex technological achievement on the back end to do that, or check a balance on your banking app or contact customer service. We started in 1997, so the timing was good, as really it was the dawn of the internet. And we worked with back in the day, we were really focused on internet service providers. And so we worked with AOL and Bell South and Ameritech and Bell Atlantic and UUNet and MFS and SBC and all names you don't know anymore because they've all been consumed by the likes of Verizon and AT&T and things like that. And we continue to work with those companies. But I would say that back in the day, probably in around 2000, 2001, the vast majority of the internet traffic that ran across the United States was going through network operating centers that we built. We were very strong in that area. In early 2001, we got our first government contract, which is very ironic because I spent almost 5 years in the government.
Yeah.
And at Booz Allen, I spent a fair amount of those time consulting with the DoD. And after I left Booz Allen and started Windward, I swore that I would never do work with the federal government again. But we got a call from the National Security Agency back in 2001, and they were doing a pretty large transformation of their operational infrastructure. And my father actually retired from the NSA, so I had some affiliation to that. And we answered the call. And now it's 20 years later. And one thing I learned as an entrepreneur is never say never. So 20 years later, a sizable part of our business, probably about 40% of our business, is federal government, specifically in the DoD and intelligence space. Again, managing large-scale networks. The Department of Defense runs the largest private network in the world. It's actually larger than many telecommunication companies throughout the world, and they run their own fiber. It's really a massive network. Nowadays, we also do a lot of work with large financial institutions, insurance companies, and even energy companies. Like I said, we don't actually manage networks. We don't staff the people into those. We build all the tools for those people to manage these large-scale networks, global networks, and massive data centers, and even large-scale customer support organizations.
Wow, it's interesting where opportunity can take you. So when you're looking at Windward as an organization, as I mentioned before, you are a ServiceNow partner, obviously probably a lot more holistic than that. I understand there's three main areas of your business. I'd love to know a little bit more about the value proposition along those three streams.
Yeah, so we have, like you said, we have three primary areas that we work in. And ServiceNow, while a major partner for us, plays a part of our overall offering. And so our first real main area is AIOps. And we really are the global leader right now in AIOps. And so if you Google AIOps investment plan, we're at the top of the list there. Nice. And we're doing a lot of thought leadership. I launched a podcast that actually comes out, I think, on June 4th is when we're season 1 of our AIOps Evolution podcast. And we're already in season 2. But so where we differ on AIOps is that we really see AIOps as a strategy and not a platform. So there's a lot of noise in the industry right now, and that's one thing about IT is that it can generate a tremendous amount of noise that it's hard to wade through. I know when we started RealOps back in 2004, within a year, everyone was talking about automation. So you go to a trade show like Gartner, and everyone's automating, and it's become such a broad term, it almost becomes irrelevant. AIOps right now is a very noisy area. A lot of people are talking about it. Certainly ServiceNow is talking about it, and companies like Splunk and Big Panda and Moogsoft. So there's a lot of discussion out there around it, but we really see it as a strategy and not as a platform. Mm-hmm. And what we do is we work with our customers on a 3 to 5 year strategy on how to bring AI and machine learning into their operations infrastructure. The second area we do a lot of work on, and we could talk about that in a little bit more into what's going on in AIOps and how we see it. The other second area we would do a lot of work is in service deployment. Deploying new services is critical, and even more so with DevOps and agile development. Cloud's playing as key to rapid deployment, and updating cloud applications and through agile means is bringing in a whole new set of complexity, especially as cloud becomes more complex, right? As you start talking, we move from virtualization to cloud virtualized to containers and microservices and things like that. It gets more and more complex. When we look at service deployment and helping customers and automating service deployment, we really look at it 3 main areas: asset and discovery, And so that's the ability to create accurate representations of your infrastructure and your real estate, provisioning and change management. So the idea of technology and processes for deploying new services and then actually maintaining those services going forward. Change management is a really key area because it creates, I read statistics that 40 to 60% of outages are caused by change management issues.
Really?
And the last is automation orchestration and using automation and orchestration to tie together multi-vendor environments to be able to provision services. So if you're trying to provision, just take a simple thing, like a new employee comes on board, you want to give them a laptop. How do you provision their VPN access? How do you provision their laptop? How do you provision their Active Directory? How do you provision into the time reporting system or Jira and things like that? So it's a multi-vendor environment that has to be really automated and orchestrated to do. The last area of the three areas we focus on is service management. And we see this as much bigger than just ITSM, an ITSM tool like ServiceNow, even though we're a big partner of ServiceNow and big fans of ServiceNow. Service management for us is a larger conversation. And the three areas we look at there is really IT service strategy. So that's working with customers, defining the services they're trying to deploy and what to deploy, and think of that as their service portfolio. The IT process alignment is the second area we look at, and that's looking at common process methodologies and process frameworks for deploying those services. And then the last is service desk optimization, where we're able to take that portfolio of services and take these processes that we've defined for delivering these services and managing these services and codifying them into a platform like ServiceNow.
And it must be really good to sit with for the organizations you support, for you to be, product agnostic or platform agnostic. I can imagine that helps that bigger conversation happen.
Yeah, that's one of our key differentiators, because our customers, and it was a key decision we made at Windward at the founding of Windward, and that is, our customers are product agnostic, therefore we need to be product agnostic. It's a hard thing to do, right? Because it would be easier to be an all-in ServiceNow company. But we felt like that would really limit our ability to help our customer and solve complex problems, because ServiceNow itself is a great tool. ServiceNow integrated into a larger ecosystem makes it an amazing tool. And when you start looking at end-to-end processes and being able to orchestrate across those, the integration of a multi-vendor environment is critical. And we're able to do that because we have so much breadth of technology experience across monitoring, CMDBs and service desks and data analytics and provisioning applications and orchestration platforms. We have all this breadth of experience that we can really come in and do something very unique and lay out a longer strategy of how to bring all this stuff together and make these investments so much more valuable.
The next couple of questions I have probably could both be podcasts on their own, so hopefully they're not too big, but I'd love to know a little bit more about the sort of overarching digital transformation trends that you're seeing within your government or federal customers specifically. If you can sort of give us a very high level overview anyway.
Sure. Yeah, and I agree with you, because we have a whole podcast coming out on AI.
I was going to say, I didn't do that plug on purpose either, but it works.
Yeah. Not that I'm plugging it, but AI. Yeah, federal sector, it's a very interesting space. And the best way I try to describe it to people is the federal government is usually about 3 to 5 years behind commercial markets. So if you want to see what's going on generally in the federal market right now, just go back to 2016 and 18 and see what CIOs at Fortune 500 companies were thinking about.
Interesting.
That being said, the government has very unique needs and challenges, and they're one of the few industries that literally affects people's lives. Mm-hmm. And so when there's a natural disaster, FEMA comes in and takes care of people, right? You have soldiers that are deployed around the world doing very mission critical things that save lives, cost lives. So these create very unique challenges in how they make decisions and how fast or slow they go. And the government is known for being slow, but sometimes you want them to go slower, because as a taxpayer, these are our funds and we want to make sure that they're being used wisely. And so what ends up happening is that you've got major challenges to them in their mission and what they're trying to do, but also in how they fund for things, because they don't really have the ability. A lot of funding is locked up 3 years, 4 years ahead of time. So they're putting in budgets now for 2023, 24. And if you're trying to make decisions in 2021, you may not have the budget to do that. And it's not even, you have to go convince somebody. You may not actually, by law, have the money to do it. And they have different colors of money. And it's very complex. And then they have these antiquated procurement processes and how they do things. So it is challenging to work for the government, but it does sometimes actually lead to a lot of satisfaction of seeing, your work being adopted by the government, how it can have impact on people's lives. Right now, I think the major challenge or a major trend we're seeing right now is in cloud adoption. And there's been some major procurements that have come out. The big one in the news is Amazon versus Azure, and Azure getting awarded a $10 billion contract and Amazon protesting it based on perceived bias from the Trump administration. But there's way more government contracts coming out around cloud. That's just the beginning. But one of the major challenges that they have is migrating legacy systems to the cloud. And we saw this and continue to see it, but really started working on this in the financial services industry several years ago, when they were trying to move to the cloud and looking at a lot of legacy applications and mainframe applications and things like that. And it's a very complex thing to do. And the government doesn't necessarily have the money to redesign and cloud enable legacy applications. They just don't have the money for it. It hasn't been programmed yet. So they moved slower. And if you look, just a good example, there's COBOL languages, which was probably antiquated when I was in college in the late 80s, is still in use in the government. But we're starting to see much greater adoption of cloud-based services. And a lot of vendors coming into and working for the government have to be FedRAMP certified, meaning that, and then run on GovCloud data centers or be deployed into federally owned and operated data centers. Like the Intel community has their own AWS data center. It's run by AWS, but nothing runs inside that data center except Intel cloud-based applications. So cloud, I think, is probably the big thing going on right now in the federal sector.
Awesome. And I must admit, when we started this podcast, I never envisioned that COBOL would be mentioned. It's really interesting. And AIOps specifically, what trends are you seeing there? And maybe you can give us a kind of catch-all summary there.
Yeah, the first thing I think people need to understand about AIOps is that it's not really AI. What's really happening right now is machine learning. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, and we will get to AI at some point. But we're still very much in the infancy of where this can go. But I believe, as a guy who has spent the last 30 years, I think, in operations, IT operations, this to me is one of the most exciting things that's come along. And IT operations is generally a slow-moving, boring space with fits of interesting things happening along the way. I think automation in the mid-2000s, when we came out with RealOps and a couple other vendors came out at the same time, that was a very interesting time too, because it was really the desire to do mass-scale automation across IT environments. So we're in the very beginning of this, and I'm really excited to see where machine learning and AI is going to take us. And I think I mentioned this to you, Ben. I just watched a really interesting documentary yesterday on YouTube around AlphaGo, and that was with Google's DeepMind project to build an automated or a AI-based game to play Go, Chinese board game Go, which I guess I didn't know much about Go ahead of time, but it's really interesting. And what was really notable about that in the end is that there's so much controversy around AI. And I think rightly can be scary to people. And I think that we have to keep check on it and see where it's going. But what was really interesting at the end is that it actually made the players that played against AlphaGo became better players, because AlphaGo started to do and make moves that humans weren't comprehending. And they looked like bad moves until they materialized over the course of the game. And all of a sudden they look like genius moves. That's a kind of an interesting takeaway. And I think that's where we should be thinking about this. You should watch it if you have time. It's an hour and a half, but it's super interesting. So right now, what AIOps is really focused on is event management, correlation, and root cause analysis. You're seeing machine learning being deployed inside of data analytics. So the key here is that AIOps is really focused on processing vast amounts of data that humans really cannot. So when you're talking about companies, like we're working with a company right now that's processing 25 terabytes of data a day, consuming 25 terabytes of data, massive amounts of data, and humans just can't process it. And you think back to 20 years ago when we were working with telecommunication companies and ISPs, and they were getting 1 million events a day. Now they're getting 1 million events a minute, and 1 million events a day was undoable, right? So technologies came out like root cause analysis and correlation that allowed you to cut that down and find really the root of problems. And now we're doing that with AI, with machine learning, which is pretty exciting. Where I really see this going now, and again, this gets back to looking at AIOps really as a strategy. I see it as a strategic technological foundation for autonomic operations. And what I mean by that is the ability to detect, isolate, diagnose, prescribe, and resolve IT issues in real time. And not only reactively, so if something goes down and you can figure out and the system actually takes it over, it will do it proactively. When it starts seeing services degraded, it will start prescribe the problem and actually resolve it in real time. And that's really, when you go back and look at this documentary on AlphaGo, that's really what was interesting, is that it started to understand the probability of solving of a move. And if you apply that to AIOps, you start looking at multiple paths for resolving a problem and being able to think 500 moves ahead of the probability of this fixing that issue and not impacting something else. That's really where we're going with this. But when you start thinking about AIOps, this goes well beyond like current states and requires integration of many components of the operational stack. So like we talked about before, companies they have a lot of technology from a lot of different vendors, and I call that their operations stack. So the ability where we're going with AIOps is the ability to embed machine learning throughout a number of these systems and vendors doing their own kind of interpretation of machine learning in their little slice, but then being able to bring all these products together and these individual slices together to create the entire pie. And this is complex, right? Because there's many vendors, how these technologies will work with each other, how they integrate. These are all things that we've been doing for the last 25 years and are really forefront of this. So I think the last point about AIOps too is that it's not just about technology. It's going to have wide-ranging impacts on organizational structures, human behavior, your policies and your procedures. So it's going to have wide-ranging impact on organizations as we bring AI and machine learning into the IT environment.
As you look at platforms, ServiceNow specifically, or similar platforms, what's next for those platforms within businesses? What's your prediction?
Yeah, I think that ServiceNow has recently categorized, and their portfolio has gotten so broad. I remember when they first started, I had sold RealOps to BMC. I was actually at BMC in 2007 to 2008, and ServiceNow was they were 5 years on the scene. I think they started in 2001, or six years on the scene. And they were winning here and there. They've come a massively long way. And now their portfolio is big, and they've actually categorized it into really 5 key areas. IT, which is their traditional area that we've spent a lot of time on. Employee, so thinking about HR and legal and workforce. Customer facing, so they rolled out CSM and their field service components, and part of that is their virtual chatbots, which is machine learning and AI, machine learning driven. Industry areas like telco, financial services, and this is some of the new stuff that they're working with partners like us on. And then Creator, which is really their no code. And what I find, and I think that's really interesting. I think the Creator component is very interesting and extremely sticky for customers to start building applications very quickly inside of ServiceNow. So when we look at these kind of 5 categories where I see a lot of growth is in the creator side, and including their app engine, integration hub, and storefront capabilities. It's actually one of the fastest growing areas for ServiceNow right now over the past 5 quarters actually. And I see that actually growing. And the other areas that we're seeing growing are on the employee and customer workflow side. And we're actually doing a fair amount of work in HR and workforce automation, not so much on the customer side for Windward. And then we continue to see strong demand for the IT areas, right? With their release with IT service management, they're kind of their flagship product. IT operations management, which is their service availability, which is really key to our AIOps vision and what we're doing and using their technology. IT business management, asset management is always key. I talked about as one of our key areas, asset and discovery, DevOps, SecOps. I'm really interested in what they're doing in SecOps and GRC, not only at Windward, but also our work over at Red Monocle in the cybersecurity space.
Looking at your career, and I'm presuming career is the word for an entrepreneur, but your journey so far, what have been some of your biggest learns as you've navigated some of your moves?
Yeah, there's 3 major things I think about with that question. One is learn business. When I was a young engineering student, they rolled out a new business minor offering to engineering students, and I got accepted into that program. And my dad convinced me to stay the course and minor in math. So I ended up with a degree in engineering, electrical engineering, and a minor in mathematics. I wish I'd done that business degree because everything that we do is business related. And I have 3 daughters, and I tell them every single day, it doesn't matter. My oldest daughter is a fashion designer. It's one of the largest industries in the world. If you don't understand how the industry works and how it makes money, then you're missing out. And if I had to go back in time, I would have really spent more time in business education, and especially in marketing. Over the years, marketing has become such a bigger thing for me, and trying to understand that. And I'm definitely in a learning mode a lot on marketing. The second area that I really would tell people is just continue to learn and leverage that learning. And what I've been able to do is, if you look at all the businesses that I've created, they're all interrelated. So we were able to leverage knowledge from our consulting business to start a software business. We were able to leverage our customer base inside of Windward to sell real ops into that customer base. And so to me, leverage is such a powerful thing. And it's not only leverage in the business world, but also in your personal growth. And the last thing I would say to people is that there are very few things that are catastrophic in business. And what I mean by that is that you lose a contract. I've lost contracts worth $3 million, $4 million a year with a phone call. We were working with the Department of Defense one time, and some type of an accounting issue happened and oversight, and they shut the whole program down. And we had almost 20 consultants on the bench the next day. Like, we had no forewarning. I look back on that time and it was devastating, but it didn't kill our business. We worked our way through it. And so there's very few things that are catastrophic, events that are catastrophic in business. But what's really important is the small things, right? The small things that you do every single day and how you execute on those small things and the details. So I tell people to really focus on the details and the day-to-day execution. And when these events happen, good or bad, right? One of my sayings is I tell people, don't ride the roller coaster. You don't ride it down low and you don't ride it real high. You just stay in the middle. And if you stay out of the rat holes of these major events, because while they seem incredibly impactful at the time, over the course of the marathon, they really aren't. And what makes you successful is the day-to-day execution and focusing on details.
I'm personally reading a lot. I've read a lot this year about compounding and putting that into your days and your weeks and your month. No, that's great advice. And I think, as we spoke before, one of the aims of the podcast, just as we're coming towards the end, is about mentorship. And I think one of the key questions we're always intrigued what people answer is that, what advice would you give to your younger self? And I'd love to hear what nuggets of information you'd go back 10, 15 years and tell yourself.
Sure. I think first is always play up, right? Always play up against somebody who's better than you. And I can look back in time of both business and personal things where like I remember when I was younger in high school, I used to ski all the time, and I skied a lot, and I'm still a very avid skier. And my brother played hockey for years, and I invited him to go skiing. He never skied before in his life, but it's the same mechanics. And within 2 hours, he's out skiing me. I just skied with him for years and years after that. And he became a ski instructor. And I became such a better skier by playing up. And I played up to his level as much as I could. And it's the same in business. And that kind of leads on to the next thing, is seek advice of people that are smarter than you. I'm 30 years into my career, and I still seek people out to help me, whether it's marketing advice or advisory services, where we just create an advisory board for Red Monocle. And it's all about just trying to find people who've done things or bring different perspectives about and fill in your gaps, and surround yourself, understanding your strengths and weaknesses and filling in those gaps around you with smarter people is really key to anyone's success, because you never get to success alone. It's just not true if people feel that way. The third thing I would say is learn from your failures. Don't allow them to define you. I've had a number of failures. I was fired prior to starting Windward. I was fired from that job I mentioned earlier, a small consultancy in New York, and it was devastating. And I put my heart and soul into that, and it was devastating when I was fired from there. 2 months later, I started Windward. And 24 years later, I've started and sold a number of businesses and built a foundation and things like that. So that never would have happened, I think. So, too many people live in the past. And when you live in the past, you're not able to be in the present of the now, nor look to the future. So learn from your mistakes, but don't dwell on them. Just leave them there and move forward. And the last area I would really say, and this has really come about later in life, it started probably 10, 15 years ago, when I started thinking about, legacy and what I'm really trying to do. And what I would tell my younger self is that there's more to life than success and money. You have to have purpose. And building a company feels like purpose at the time, but it's not necessarily the real purpose of why you're here on this earth. And I feel like we all have an opportunity to leave this planet better than when we got here. And using your business as leverage to do that. And I started a foundation in 2016 focused on Alzheimer's, focused on caregivers of Alzheimer's patients. And that came out of experience I had with my father, who passed away in 2013 of Alzheimer's. So it's called the Windward Foundation. And to me, that is really filled this void of having purpose and really making sense of all the hard work that we do and the success that we've had. And hard work we continue to do, we do it now with purpose. I'm not saying that success and financial success and notoriety are bad things. I don't believe that at all. I don't. But I think that you also find, if you really look at being a mission-driven capitalist, then you will use those things as leverage to even higher purpose.
Sean, you've given us so much to think about and learn, and I think those pieces of advice, just to close off, are fantastic, and anyone can take those into their lives. Is there anything you'd just like to add before we call it a day?
Yeah, if you want to talk to us around AIOps and as a leading, global AIOps thought leader, go to windward.com, WINDWARD.com. If you're looking for a job to work with our team, please just click on the careers tab. If you're interested in more thoughts on AIOps, feel free to email me directly. I'm at Sean@windward.com. Also, I encourage people to check out Red Monocle to see what we're doing around quantifying cybersecurity risk. Again, email me if you're interested in that. And on that last point, I'm doing a fair amount of work around mission-driven capitalism. So I have a new website called wheelsupworld.com. And there you can see the work that we're doing with the Windward Foundation, which we're actually branding as the Alzheimer's Caregiver Alliance, and the work that we're doing around Alzheimer's caregiver support.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much, Sean. This has been a pleasure. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I really enjoyed being here.
AI in Action is brought to you by Alldus International, covering your business's staffing, consulting, and networking needs. Alldus offer an exec search program. Alldus can help you discover how data science and AI can transform your company. With our unrivaled network of C-suite executives and senior AI professionals, we offer retained search services across the US and Europe. For more information, contact mark@alldus.com. Get the Alldus advantage. Become a member of the Alldus community and enjoy some of the following: AI meetups. Once a month, our community gathers to listen to some of the leading experts in the world of data science and AI. Our speakers come from all over the world, including Dublin, Boston, and Frankfurt. We also have our AI mentors. Our experts will provide mentoring to Alldus members. And don't forget our AI in Action podcast. Each week we have guests from all over the world talking us through their education, career, and more. Become an Alldus member and get the Alldus advantage. For more information and to sign up for our newsletter, log on to www.alldus.com. That's www.alldus.com. Alldus International, empowering through AI.